There we go. So just a recap of where we were last week. So last week we saw the question, how do you calculate what you owe somebody after having, injured them for pain, right? And we looked at, all of the interesting theoretical questions around, how do we, the Talmud understands that pain is subjective. And so there's all sorts of questions around, even though it's subjective, we still want to establish a baseline standard. Who do we follow? Do we follow the person who was injured, or do we follow the person who caused the injury to establish the standard for calculating the monetary value of pain? And the reason that the rabbis fall out on the person who caused the pain, not the person who suffered it, is because they don't want to demean the person who experienced the pain. So even in the pain scale piece, you're starting to see how they're thinking about how multifaceted the laws of damages are, and how we're considering both the physical and the emotional impact on the person who suffered the pain. The other piece that we saw last week that's really important is the Talmudic principle of klal uprat, which, just as a reminder to everyone, means from the general to the specific. You can do the flip of it, prat uklal. And this is just one of the core baseline concepts of interpreting Torah. And that's the understanding that when you have a sequence of items in the Torah presented, a list, or even two, do you understand the first to be the general and then everything after that to be limiting, and like the only the specific examples that count? Or do you understand it to be an example and then a broad generalizing? And the example that we used last week, and it was great, we had a lawyer with us who validated all of this, was the idea that if I said, for example, that a legal regulation referred to tables, chairs, desks, and other furniture, so that would be prat uklal, right? So the specifics would be tables, chairs, and desks, and other furniture, that would be the klal, that's the general. And we all agreed that when it says other furniture, we know that it's not talking about lawn chairs and umbrellas. We know that it's talking about office furniture, right? Or things that could reasonably be assumed to be office furniture. So that's the same way the Talmud works. And that's why we were spending time last week looking at how the Talmud spends time on when it lists all the different kinds of pain, right? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, foot for a foot. And then it goes into these general things, wound for a wound, bruise for a bruise. How do we understand those general concepts, right? And are they entirely general, or are they only related to the specific examples that came before them? So that was last week. This week, we move on to medical costs and healthcare, right? That's something that people care lots about and have strong opinions on. So we are on page, we're on text number 9, which is on page 12. Is that big enough for people? Look good? No, we're going to make it bigger. Okay. I should remind people also, because we all forget this. I forget this too. That in Zoom, you can zoom in on what I'm presenting. Also, I think it's up in window or view, somewhere up at the top. If you are looking to do that also. How's that? Is that bigger? Is that better? Still not big enough. How about now? Okay. All right. Carla, will you kick us off today?
How is payment for medical costs assessed? If one struck another, then he is liable to heal him. The sages taught in the Baraita to Septa 9:4. If growths appeared due to the injury and the wound reopened, then the one who caused the injury is again liable to heal him by covering his medical costs, and is liable to give him the value of his loss of livelihood while he recovers from the reopened wound. But if the growths are not due to the injury, he is not liable to heal him by covering his medical costs, and he is not liable to give him the value of his loss of livelihood. Okay, I'm not understanding what growths are in here.
Great. What? Say more about that. What are you wondering about?
Do they mean bruises, swelling?
Okay, so there's a question of like what is included in the concept of growth, right? What does that actually mean? Um, for now, um, I think that we can understand it as um, any like subsequent injury that happens as a result of the primary injury, right?
Okay, that makes sense. I get it.
Yeah.
Okay. Rabbi Yehuda says that.
Okay, so hold on, don't let's not speed past this. So what is the Talmud setting up here, right? There's a set of assumptions here. First of all, let's say, what are you liable for if you cause an injury to someone in the realm of ripui, which is the word for medical, it means healing, basically. For medical costs, what are you liable for?
Medical bills and loss of income.
Right. So it's interesting that it like slips right into something else, which is the next thing that we're going to talk about anyways. In 2 weeks, we're going to talk about loss of income. But the first is that the language the Talmud uses is healing, right? He's liable to heal him. That means you have to pay for all of the associated costs in healing. There was a professional medical class, right? It existed. There were doctors, there were healers. Talmud has all sorts of interesting things to say about medicine. But there was certainly an understanding that that costs money, and whoever causes the injury has to pay for everything associated with that healing. Right? But then it seems to have some other assumptions or things that it's concerned about. What else is it concerned about?
Consequences. Like
Uh, Keep going. Say more.
like, okay, so I break my hip in an accident or something like that, and my hip is repaired, but as a result, arthritis sets in, and now I have a permanent limp, and I'm no longer able to
Great.
do some physical task that I had to do for my livelihood.
Yeah. Okay. So not great actually, but but yes, that's a good example, right? The Talmud's concerned with long-term implications. Angel, yeah, the Talmud's concerned with, are we talking here about only the original act of wounding someone, or are there other like associated concerns? Yeah, Mom, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I guess the question I would ask is, how do you prove that the secondary condition came directly from the original wound? Because sometimes there can be a delay where the original wound has healed, but something else pops up that can be traced. So how do you prove that?
Okay, so yes, that is one of the right. But even before that, there seems to be an assumption that sometimes this happens, right? Sometimes you'll get injured, and then there will be a secondary injury or condition. If it's directly related to the injury you caused, then you're responsible. But then there's like this, well, great. How do you prove that? What do you know? So at least where we've left off right here, the Talmud is, or the Baraita rather, is teaching that if it's directly related to the damage you caused, you're liable, and if it's not, then you're not, right? Okay, so just some technical things. We said ripui is the term for medical costs or your liability to heal someone. Tosefta is the name of the collection of Baraitas. So we're all familiar by this point that the Baraitas are all these other early teachings floating around from the time of the Mishnah. They are collected in a collection called the Tosefta, or just Tosefta. And they were never kind of like, when they were being taught, they were never intended to become like this separate book and separate collection, but now we can find them in that place. And it's useful because it mirrors in different ways the structure of the Mishnah and the Talmud. So you can see what other, or rather the Mishnah, not the Talmud, you can see what other conversations are happening. Okay, so that's the first part. Let's keep going. Okay, Carla, Rabbi Yehuda.
Rabbi Yehuda says that even if the growths appear due to the injury, he is liable to heal him by covering his medical costs, but he is not liable to give him the value of his loss of livelihood. And the rabbis say the one who caused the injury is not liable at all, because the Torah states the chalafot of compensation for his loss of livelihood and his medical costs together. Anyone who is liable for loss of livelihood is liable for medical costs, and anyone who is not liable for loss of livelihood is not liable for medical costs.
So we have a dispute, right? So the opening tells us that you're liable both for healthcare and for lost wages. And Rabbi Yehuda says that, yeah, but even if these growths, these secondary injuries, are a direct result of that injury, yes, of course you have to pay for the healing of them. But if you miss work, you're not responsible, right, for paying for that person's lost wages. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. And then the rabbis in general, right, the collective voice of the rabbis say, no, you're actually not liable for any of these secondary conditions at all. You don't have to pay for anything. How could you have foreseen that? You wouldn't know that. And they ground that idea in the Torah, which teaches, the sources that this is based on are, and we'll see that we're going to get to them in a minute, that they appear together, right? So in the mind of the rabbis, since they appear together, you can't separate them and say, well, in this case, one is applicable and the other one's not. No, they're right there as a single concept. And therefore, if you're liable for one, then you're liable for the other. But there's no universe where you're not. And since now they're imagining that, no, you're not responsible for unforeseen, unintended consequences, then no, you don't have to pay at all. So interesting debate that we've wandered into here, right? Like, how much responsibility do you have when you cause damage to someone? Does your responsibility extend far past anything that you could reasonably have intended? Yeah, Mom.
Do they have anything to, this is a bit of a tangent, but do they have anything to say about medical malpractice? That it might be poor medical care that resulted in the secondary condition?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, we'll wait for it.
You will wait for it. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if we get to it this week. It might be next week on this.
Can I just ask a question also? I'm sorry. Let's say I'm in an automobile accident. Okay. Shlomo's driving his horse and his cart, and he runs into another horse and cart, right?
Wow.
Everything seems, sorry, hold on.
Mhm.
Everything seems to be okay at the time of the collision, right? Nobody's damaged. Shlomo doesn't have any bruises. He doesn't have anything that is a problem, right? But 2 weeks later, Shlomo passes out. And as we know, that could happen with post-traumatic, concussion syndromes, right?
Yeah.
Is that part of liability that something happened, even though it may not be visible?
Yeah.
The obvious cause of that injury was the collision,
Yeah.
right?
So I think it's a great case study. Last week we looked at the question, or it might have been 2 weeks. No, it was last week. I don't remember. Earlier, we looked at the concept of like a bruise to your fingernail or a burn to your fingernail. And the Talmud wanted to know, do all of these laws apply only to visible damage, right? Or does invisible damage also cost? So there's some of that there, which is intriguing to think about here. Yeah, like how do you know? Is there statute of limitations for this?
Also, if Shlomo's responsible for the crash, does the other person still have to pay for his injuries? It's like, I think about sports people, right? If a football player knowingly goes into a game, suffers a traumatic head injury, and then sues the opposing team for causing his head injury.
Can't do that, right?
Right.
Right. And here we're in the realm of unintended damages, right? Yeah, I mean, if you like intentionally put yourself in harm, actually this conversation does go into that, because you're not allowed to do that, right? And halachically, you can't put yourself in harm's way. Yeah, just for personal advantage, right? Okay, Carla, and then let's see where this goes.
Okay, I find this very disturbing because it looks like, according to the rabbis, they're not responsible for him either after the initial injury and the initial medical time. But,
Yeah.
okay, so I'm thinking specifically, there's a homeless guy who lives, who begs on Bloor Street near my daughter's apartment, and he's a vet. He lost a leg in Afghanistan, and he doesn't have enough from the veterans
Yeah.
pension or whatever to afford his freaking rent. And who do the rabbis think is going to look after people who died, who suffered in our service
Yeah.
and were injured? Like, this is
Yeah.
nonsense.
Yeah. 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 Okay, so first of all, that on its own is just so morally egregious. That's my opinion. This would not, I mean, again, like, there's all sorts of separate questions around, like, military wounds. So that's not what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about to what degree, and I'm trying to be charitable now listen, like, I think you should be responsible if you, for the unintended consequences of what you do. But I think the Talmud is trying to say, like, okay, fine. Let's say I accept that. To what degree, right? Like, how fair is it to reasonably assume that you have responsible for all of those consequences that may come down the road? And that's what we're trying to solve out. We're only like, a few verses in, so we'll see where this goes. But yeah, Vanix.
So normally I don't cut the rabbis a lot of slack, you know that. But I'm going to cut the rabbis a lot of slack. Because when this was written, they did not have the medical advances that we have today.
Yeah.
In a normal injury lawsuit, it's a long time before the statement of claim is even issued. And at that point, anybody who's had any type of an injury has probably been to at least 5 or 6 doctors and has been able to establish what, in fact, a potential long-term outcome is going to be to their injury. Not to mention, again, in a normal lawsuit today, we're dealing with both general compensation and specific compensation. But they didn't have that capability back then.
Yeah, and I think that's a little bit of, right. And I think that's a bit of what's happening here, right? Is there's like, how do we know? Right? What do we do? Now, we do know a little bit about we actually are going to see right now a little bit of their medical practice and their medical knowledge. Okay, Dawn, will you read with what do they disagree? We're going to pause at the end of this tiny little chunk, and then you can keep going.
With regard to what do they disagree? Rabbah said, I found the sages in the study hall of Rav when they were sitting and were stating, here, I need to make it a little bigger. Here, Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis disagree about whether a wound may be bandaged.
Okay, so a couple things here. One is when the Talmud comes in and asks you, like, okay, what are they disagreeing about? It could be a clue that whoever assembled this feels the same way that some of us do, of like, well, wait a minute, that feels a little bit weird. You're not responsible for any of this at all. And so for the Talmud to come in, the narrator of the Talmud saying, well, what are they, is a way of saying, like, hold on, you think they're disagreeing about this, but they're not. They're actually disagreeing about something else, right? We can't say that for certain, but whenever you see that, like, the hand of the editor coming in, it's a clue that we're trying to be guided in a particular direction here, right? And so now we get this like little mini story of like, oh, like, yeah, they were all sitting around trying to figure this out, and what they were actually disagreeing about was whether a wound can be bandaged. Okay, so here's the little, now we're getting a window into what medicine looked like in the time of the Talmud. What does it mean when they say? So the scenario here is, can you bandage up a wound to lessen the pain, which is something that they knew happened, right? That's, often when you like hurt yourself, wrapping it up makes it feel better, at the risk of causing side effects for doing that. And that's what the debate is here around whether a wound can be damaged. Meaning, if I am hurt and the person who injured me is responsible for my healing, can part of that healing be to bandage up my wound, and then they have to pay for that, knowing that maybe it will get infected, right? I'll feel better, but 2 days later it's going to get infected. is the person then responsible for covering the cost of that infection? Okay. It's a result of my injury that this person caused, but the healing inadvertently led to that. And we should have known. And so that's what the debate is right here. Not over like broadly, are you responsible, but for what are the particular conditions under which you're responsible. Yeah, Vance.
What I'm wondering about with this is, what about, and I'm going back to like what other people have said, but what about the hidden damage? For example, you get into a car accident and you've got cuts and bruises, so they bandage the cuts and bruises, but you also have a subdural hematoma.
Yeah.
Right. You know,
You'll find about it till later.
is invisible.
Yeah.
Because, you know, a week, a month, a year later, whatever, you die.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's see where this goes, because like you said before, you know, they are familiar with invisible. They don't have the same kind of, they're familiar with invisible pain. They obviously don't have the same degree of internal medicine expertise as we do. So let's see how this might play out here. Okay, Don, continue. Rabba explains.
All right, so can we change the scenario that I just painted and say a week or two later, the guy dies? Who knows from what?
Yeah. Well, that's the question, right? That's exactly. That's the question. And death is different because if it causes, yeah, let's set death aside, right? Because that brings up a whole separate extra kind of world. Here the question is like, to what degree are you responsible for paying for the continual healing of someone, right? And how can you be certain that it's directly related to the injury that was caused? So let's continue this idea, because we split it up in the middle, and let's see what Rabba explains here. I'll scroll up.
By the way, I keep thinking about a fake cervical collar after a car accident.
Yeah.
You know, a shyster lawyer says, put it on because, you know, influence the court. Anyway.
Yeah.
But that's what I thought about bandaging a wound. It just shows you how cynical I am about
Yeah, sure.
Anyway. All right. Rabbi explains, the rabbis hold that a wound may be wrapped in a bandage, and Rabbi Yehuda holds that a wound may not be wrapped in a bandage. Therefore, with regard to medical costs, which the verse repeated, Verapo Yerape, is that
Yep.
Yeah. I should look at the other side to do that. The one who caused the injury is liable. But for loss of livelihood, about which the verse did not repeat, the one who caused the injury is not liable to pay compensation.
Okay. So Verapo Yerape means whenever this is just a biblical form of biblical poetry, whenever you see a word repeated in that way, in English, we would read it as surely he shall heal him, or something like that, right? It's an intensifier, right? But when the rabbis are reading it, that, you know, the doubling can mean different things, right? Each word can mean something different. So here we get the explanation, right? The rabbis say, yes, you can wrap the wound in the bandage, even if it might cause other pain. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, that's not a good idea. So consequently, according to the opinion of the rabbis, if the bandage caused side effects, which lead the injured party to incur additional medical expenses, those are considered to have resulted from the original injury, okay? According to the opinion of the rabbis. But Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you can't do that, right? Because it wouldn't be considered that. He doesn't want that to happen. Okay, let's continue with Rabba. Rabba continues. Oh, John, you're muted.
My bad. Rabbi Yehuda continues, and
Rabba continues.
Rabba continues. And I said to them that if Rabbi Yehuda were to hold that a wound may not be wrapped in a bandage, then the one who caused the injury should not be liable for medical costs. Rather, everyone agrees that a wound may be wrapped in a bandage, but may not be wrapped in an excessive bandage.
Okay, so you're saying, like, wait a minute, right? If I agree with Rabbi Yehuda, right, that you can't do that, well, then how would you be like? Are you responsible for anything, right? So he said, okay, so what we're really talking about here, the debate, what it's really about is how tightly, right? Look, you can do this. It's okay. This healing is all right. Just don't be excessive. we're not directly addressing malpractice, but we're getting close to it, right? We're getting close to it, Mom, to your question of, who's, if you sanction a medical procedure that turns out to have unintended negative consequences, to what degree are you responsible? And we're starting to see them deal with that. And that's why this section of the Talmud is relied upon in the halakhic discourse on medical malpractice. Angel, I would not be surprised if the rabbis were considered with the size of Band-Aids. They don't have the multi-packs that we do where they come in different sizes, but yeah. Okay, Mom.
Yeah, I just wanted to look at Carla's question in the chat. Do they award compensation for the loss of ability to have children? That relates somewhat to the story of a car accident that I was talking about last week when we were assessing damages. One of the things that my doctor wrote in his report was that because I was of sort of prime childbearing age, there was a possibility that the car accident might affect my ability to carry a baby to term, or it might cause problems, sort of chronic pain problems related to the pregnancy because of the back injury. So, Carla, I guess the answer, might be yes.
Might be yes. And the source texts on this in the Torah refer to, someone who pushes a pregnant woman down the stairs. Right? So I think it's certainly in their mind, right? Something that they're considering. Yeah. You could also certainly rely on, these texts if you were thinking about like long-term consequences, right? Yeah. Panics.
So here's where I'm getting caught up in this, and I guess I apologize only because of my background. Are they getting some advice from doctors here when they're making all of these proclamations? I mean, they're rabbis, they're not doctors.
Well, some of them are, yeah, right? The profession of rabbi doesn't exist until like a couple hundred years ago. So some of these rabbis are doctors, and some of them are not and have no business doing that. Yeah. Yeah, actually, your question on expertise will also show up. I can't remember if it shows up in this section, but this is great, right? I think one of the things is it's really delightful. One of the things about these questions around malpractice and expertise is that we all intuit them when we're reading this, but the rabbis do too. We're just not there yet. We haven't gotten to it in the text. And it's always lovely when we see that kind of mirroring take place. Okay, let's finish off. Let's go over to Rabbi Yehuda. Mom, will you read Rabbi Yehuda?
Rabbi Yehuda holds that since a wound may not be in an excessive bandage, and with regard to medical costs, about which the verse repeated, Verapo Yerapeh, the one who caused the injury is liable. But for loss of livelihood, about which the verse did not repeat, the one who caused the injury is not liable to pay compensation. And the rabbis hold, since the verse repeated the obligation for medical costs, one is also liable to pay compensation for loss of livelihood, which is juxtaposed to medical costs.
Okay, so basically what we've done is we've brought together the different strands here, right? Okay, fine. We're not talking about any bandaging. We're just talking about excessive bandaging. And then the debate goes back to the earlier question. Does that beclude loss of livelihood, or are we only talking about healing costs here? And this all hinges on the verses around which Verapo Yerapeh appears. According to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, yes, you would pay for both, but for loss of livelihood, according to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, you would not pay for the loss of livelihood because that doesn't repeat. But the rabbis say, since it does repeat for obligation and medical costs, then you are also for livelihood. And again, just flagging for folks, we haven't even gotten to the next category of how do you pay for loss of livelihood, right? It's just bound up in here alongside the healthcare costs. Okay, Mom, keep going. And Rabbi Yehuda holds.
And Rabbi Yehuda holds that the one who caused the injury is not liable for loss of livelihood because the merciful one restricted it. Only he shall pay for his loss of livelihood and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. And the rabbis hold that the word only is coming to exclude growths that were not due to the injury.
Okay, so here this is just like classic rabbinic interpretation. Does the word only mean that you only have to pay for healing and not for, that you only have to pay for medical costs and not for loss of livelihood? Or does the word only mean you only pay for the initial injury and not for kind of anything else that happens down the road that was not due to that injury? Right? Great debate. Not entirely clear. Could go either way. Let's see where it goes. Keep going, Mom. And according to the
Sure.
latter.
And according to the later rabbis in the Baraita, who say anyone who is liable for loss of livelihood is liable for medical costs, and anyone who is not liable for loss of livelihood is not liable for medical costs. How do I account for the fact that the verse repeated the obligation to pay medical costs?
Okay, pause. So here you just see just some of their like baseline thinking, right? And just the fundamental assumptions, which is, listen, if you're liable for one, then you're liable for the other, right? You can't separate them. And the other, and then the inverse of that is, well, therefore, if you're not liable for one of them, then you're not liable for the other, right? But that raises an additional question, which is, well, wait a minute. Then why is there a separate instruction to pay for medical costs? If that's true, then I wouldn't need that, right? You wouldn't need that separate instruction. So why is it there? Now we're going to get the answer.
It is necessary for that which the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught, as it is taught in a Baraita that the school of Rabbi Yishmael says, when the verse states, and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed, it is derived from here that permission is granted to a doctor to heal,
Okay.
and thereby incur medical costs. Right?
Yes, and also what you're seeing here is a little bit of Judaism's perspective on medicine. There are some religious traditions today that view medicine as counter to the will of God, right? Whatever happens to you, it's God's will. We don't believe that, right? In fact, we believe quite the opposite, that we should take advantage of all of the technological abilities that we have to preserve life, right? To the extent that we can. Now there's, I worked in a hospital, there's all sorts of questions as to what does that actually mean, but on a very small baseline, the understanding is that human beings are allowed to heal other human beings, right? And that's what they're saying right here. Is that's what that verse is for, right? He shall surely be healed. Why do you need that? To tell you that we have permission to do that, right? We are allowed to do that. And when you heal someone, you're not going against God's will, right? Because certainly, even in the time of the Mishnah and the Baraitas and the Talmud, there were, questions about, oh, if someone gets sick, is that God punishing them? And if so, can I heal that person? And the answer is yes, you can heal that person. Right. Okay, Vanix.
I'm not sure how to ask the question. Does this emphasize the saving of a life is paramount to everything? I forget the Hebrew, but and I think and if I'm not mistaken, is that not from Pirkei Avot, and does that not come right out of the Talmud?
It's not. This is just how prominent this is in our tradition, that we think it's from everywhere. Yeah. All this is talking about here is that you as a human being are allowed to practice medicine. It's not counter to the will of God, right? We haven't assigned any value statements beyond that. We haven't kind of gone to what degree can you do that? All we're saying here is that you as a human being are allowed to heal other people. Carla, your question in the chat, is there insurance? No, thankfully there's no insurance. In fact, I imagine that the Talmud, I think I mentioned this last week, that there are actually some questions around should you be doing that? Because buying insurance is essentially gambling. And there are all sorts of questions around whether or not you should be allowed to do that. That is a separate question, not touching it. But this question has come up of what if you can't afford to pay for this? And I did do some research and look into this, and it does address it. Actually, it's in the same section of Talmud we're in just before we started, and there are several answers to the question, including basically that the easiest one is you pay as you're able to, basically over time, right? You pay it out to the degree that you can. Okay, Vanix, and then let us keep going through this Baraita.
Jesse, can I just get a clarification, please?
Mhm.
Do I assume that the reason that that was stated, i.e. that humans are allowed to heal humans, is because there was a school of thought at that time within Judaism that they couldn't? Like,
Well,
you
it's a
always-
great example of if I put up a sign that tells you you're allowed to do something, why is that sign there, right?
Right, exactly.
Is it because other people are telling you that you can't do that? I don't know. It's a good deduction, right? I don't know what everybody was thinking, but what I can tell you is that according to a Baraita, which tells you that I have this verse in the Torah that says he shall surely be healed, and the rabbi's interpretation is that that gives you license to heal other people. It would be a good deduction that there were people who thought that you weren't allowed to do that.
Okay, thank you.
The cultural backdrop, by the way, of both of these. So the Baraitas are in the time of Roman rule, right? That's the cultural backdrop. They have medicine, right? And then the Talmud, the cultural backdrop is Zoroastrianism, right? In Sasanian Persia, right? So that's what's kind of that's what everybody around them is familiar with, are all these other traditions. And so you would want to look at and see like, oh, well, what do they feel about healing and these kind of things? What do they think about, is it intervening in divine will? Okay, so now we've explained what that extraneous verse is for, right? Everything good? Good. Okay, well, we'll see how, maybe it's not all good. Okay, Mom, keep reading the sages taught in a Baraita.
The sages taught in a Baraita, from where is it derived that if growths appear to the injury and a wound reopened, then the one who caused the injury is again liable to heal him by covering his medical costs, and is liable to give him the value of his loss of livelihood while he recovers from the reopened wound? The verse states, and he shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. That's the Verapo Europe, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
One might have thought, even if the growths were not due to the injury. Therefore, the verse states only. Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda says, even if the growths appeared due to the injury, the one who caused the injury is exempt as it is stated only.
All right. So opinion number one is absolutely you're responsible for this person's healing costs, but only the things that are directly related to, right? And it's like Lovely says, you might have thought that that wasn't the case. Why? Because it says like, surely he shall be, thoroughly he shall, right? Like with this intensifier, you might have thought that it applied to like everything. By the way, people were asking questions about like insurance and kind of legal interpretations of these. Yeah, this happens, right? Like how precise was the terminology and what does that lead you to reasonably understand? And here the Talmud is saying like, yeah, it might be totally reasonable to assume that you're responsible for paying for everything. Why? Because the Torah says verapo yerape. So it's like, right. But it also says only, right? And that's the limiter, right? Condenses. Okay, Ben. Or Mom, go ahead and then we'll pop
No,
up
I was just going to ask you, what is the Hebrew for only?
I think it's af. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, af over here.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Vanix. Oh no, it's rock.
Oh,
Sorry.
rock.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
modern
I see
Hebrew.
it. Rock.
Yeah,
Yeah.
rock. Yeah. That's normal, the normal word for only. Okay, Vanix.
I think it's interesting that at least I think what this is saying is in terms of livelihood and in terms of recompense for lost livelihood, it is simply until the physical is healed. So if I'm not sure whether I'm interpreting this correctly, but that seems to be saying you're entitled to medical expenses until you're healed, but you're also entitled to loss of livelihood, but only until this is healed.
That would be a good interpretation. And that will be part of the conversation when we go into actually saying, how do we assess loss of livelihood, right? Yeah. And now you can start to see why are these two in particular tied up in each other, right? And like, why aren't we talking about damages here? Why aren't we talking about kind of the emotional impact here? Okay. Angel, do you want to read There Are Only Those? No? Okay. All right. So we're just going to cycle through the three of us. That's cool. Carla, will you read There Are Those Who Say?
There are those who say that Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says, even if the growths appear due to the injury, the one who caused the injury is completely exempt. And this is in accordance with the opinion of the later rabbis in the previous Baraita. And there are those who say that Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says, even if the growths appear due to the injury, the one who caused the injury is exempt from loss of livelihood, but is liable for medical costs. In accordance with whose opinion is this statement? It is in accordance with the opinion of his father, Rabbi Yehuda.
Okay. So the Talmud says, Ika de Amre, there are some people, right? We're going to getting the diversity of opinion here, and like, yeah, but there are other people who have different opinions. One of those opinions is that even if the like secondary injuries are directly caused by yours, you're not responsible at all, right? And there are other people who go even further than that and say, and you don't even have to pay for loss of livelihood for those, right? Like, okay, fine, yes, the medical costs, but not the loss of livelihood. This is all part of the conversation of how do we understand the limits on this, right? I think, Mom, when you were reading, you started us off this morning by saying, like, how do you prove any of this? How do you know? And so you can see right here the concern with creating a system that's designed to be supportive and morally sound, but not get taken advantage of, right? How far does this ultimately go? Carla, you have feelings about this.
It's protecting the perpetrator and not the victim. What the fuck? Sorry.
Right? Yes, that is absolutely one interpretation. And if I may, right, this is something I always try to guide us through, right? Pay attention to when the narrator of the Talmud feels the need to interject itself. Then it pops in and it says, who said that? Right? I don't know if this is what the editor had in mind, but I see this and I say, like, they're like, that's an interesting opinion. I would like to know more about who said that, right? And like, oh, it was his dad, right? So, you see it. I'm not trying to be cynical about this at all, but the Talmud is really trying to interrogate, like, okay, that could be a valid opinion textually, right? We've established that is an okay textual opinion. Let's make sure we understand the implications of that and where this idea is coming from, right? Okay, Mom, Don.
I guess this has sort of been said in a number of ways, but I guess what really disturbs me about this is that on the one hand, it does put in a safeguard against excessive litigation, litigiousness, but it doesn't allow for the inability of the medical profession, even today, to predict accurately how long a physical injury is going to affect a person and what the side effects of the injury are. So, how do you deal with that? I mean, I'm thinking about, Don, you brought up like the head injuries in football. So that is something where people have put themselves in harm's way. But like, we're just now learning, in recent years about the long-term effects of repeated
So because you're
concussions.
totally right. You're totally right. But we're not talking about a situation here where you have voluntarily submitted yourself to a dangerous situation where you get injured. We're talking about an accident.
But
Right?
okay,
so it could apply here.
Accident. Yeah.
Yeah. So a person has gets a concussion in a wagon accident and seems to be fine. And Peter brought this up too about a what do you call it? Subdural hematoma. We all know that term because we all watch hospital shows, right? So, yeah, are the rabbis going to deal with stuff that pops up down the road?
I mean, isn't that what they're dealing with right now? They're trying to figure out how far does this go, right? Like how far? Because if it's very clear that it's part of the initial injury, there's no debate, right? Like, of course you're paying for the healing. There's no debate around that, right?
Okay.
The question here is like, what counts as that?
I guess my question then would boil down to this. At what point is the case closed and is not able to be reopened?
That's what we're trying to figure out. That's exactly what we're trying to figure out.
Is
Right.
there, is it open-ended? Can a person go back in a year and say, this happened because of my accident?
Presumably, according to the opinion, that you are liable for secondary costs if it seemed evident that yes, right, this was a secondary side effect or something from according to the opinion that you are liable, then yes. But there are those who hold that you're not liable for those, right? Which is who we're looking at now. Yeah, Don.
Yeah, I'm going to build on that. I'm stuck on this idea that they pay for the medical costs, but they don't pay for loss of livelihood. So at what point is the victim made whole from an accident that is clearly not his or her fault?
Yeah,
And-
that's the meta question.
And
Yeah.
that is a tremendously disturbing thing here. I mean, Carla's point is very well taken. It's protecting the perpetrator rather than protecting the victim. And maybe they've leaned too far to one side without finding the balance on the other side. Loss of livelihood is a real thing in accidents. And that's what, Phil told us this last week. The actuarial tables give us what that looks like. If somebody struck me in the throat, right, and I could no longer sing, that ends my career. And what does that look like in terms of loss of livelihood? Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda is saying, no, you don't get that. You just get whatever your medical costs were for the injury.
Well, okay, so a couple things. Yossi Bar Yehuda is not saying that you don't get loss of livelihood. He's saying if a secondary injury happened as a result of the healthcare, or as a result of the first
vocal nodes happen.
Yeah. Let's play with this. Let's say you have somebody injures you and you need to have some kind of scopic surgery that goes down your throat. And as a result of that medical procedure, you develop nodes. And as a result of those nodules, now you can't sing. To what degree is the first person responsible for them? And I think there is one opinion of this that ultimately that serves to protect the perpetrator and not the injured person. By the way, there are those who say, right, why do I need to introduce it in that way? Because it's not the majority opinion. This is just another opinion, right? We've already established what kind of the main parties to the debate are, and this is like a side debate that's happening, right? And I mentioned earlier that it seems like the Talmud is like really like, are you sure about this? Like, where are you getting this idea from? But why is it here? Because there is a valid concern of where are the bumpers? Where are the guardrails to this system, right? And the guardrails could be too restrictive, right? And that's what they're trying to figure out is like, how restrictive do we want to create this to make sure we don't go off the rails? Because the flip of that is, well, it would be very easy just to claim that, like, basically after an injury, everything that happens to you for the rest of your life is negatively impacted by that, and therefore the injuring part, the person who injured you, is liable. That wouldn't be fair for that person, right? So there's also an assumption here of like fairness and equality before the law, that yes, you're responsible for the damage you caused, but it has to be fair and just. Where are the guardrails to create that just system? Yeah. And I think I'm hedging my bets here. I think the Talmud agrees with Carla and Don that Yossi Bar Yehuda and his dad have put the guardrails on too tightly. Yeah, I think. Okay, Vanix, and then we're almost at where we need to get to today in this. And I have a hard stop at 10, just so people know. Okay.
The narrator steps in twice in this paragraph. Steps in and says, there are those that say ... And then he steps in again, exactly where you just highlighted. All right. The thing that's bothering me about that paragraph, the whole paragraph, is the principle that if it's older, it's better. And that's why the narrator comes in and says, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who's the older, who's the father.
Yeah, no, they might be in the same era, right? So it's not just that like your age in absolute years gives you more authority. It's of like what generation of scholarship are you? But it's a baraita, so it's not codified in the Mishnah, right? It's outside of the Mishnah, so it does hold weight, but it doesn't hold the same weight as the Mishnah, right?
Rabbi Yehuda is always seems, no, I'm gonna start that sentence over again. Rabbi Yehuda is given credit for an awful lot of stuff that, and
Yeah.
he's the word that comes to mind is respected, and I'm not sure where
Yeah,
that's.
yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah. I mean, but all of this here is from a baraita, right? So we're not dealing here with, you know, something that's directly out of the Mishnah. So that also changes the degree of its weight and authority right here. It's clearly still important, right? Because they're trying to figure out where are the guardrails, right? But I think, yeah. Okay, so we haven't even finished this off yet. Let's get to the master says. A reminder that when the Talmud says the master, it's ibit. It's talking about the previously quoted rabbi. So we're talking about Rabbi Yehuda here and Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda, right? And what else do I want to say to people about this? Oh, just that sometimes there's also a rabbi named Mar, which means rabbi, or which means master. So sometimes when it's Mar, it's literally the human named Mar, and sometimes when it's Mar, it's ibid. So you just have to, it's context, right? So here we know that it's saying ibid. Mom, will you read the master set?
The master said, one might have thought this, even if the growths were not due to the injury. Therefore, the verse states only, is there a need for the verse to teach that he is exempt in the case of growths that were not due to the injury?
Right, which is basically a way of saying you're not going to be exempt in the case of growths that were not due to the injury. So why you wouldn't have the need for that. So that like wraps up this kind of like mini discourse. This is not the conclusion, by the way, right? This is just a postscript to all of that. And let's read this last little chunk, which Don, you get to have some fun words. I think it's your turn again, right?
Good.
The
Okay.
sages say.
The sages say, what did the Baraita mean when it said that the growths were not due to the injury? As it is taught in a Baraita, in the case of one who violated his doctor's instructions and ate honey or any type of sweets, because honey or any type of sweets are detrimental to recovery from the injury, and his injury developed gargutini?
Gargutini, yeah.
Gargutini. One might have thought that one who caused the injury would be liable to heal him. Therefore, the verse states only to teach that he is exempt in this case. What are gargutini? Abaya said necrosis. What is its remedy? Crystalline ice plant and wax and wine dregs.
Okay. So I told you the Talmud has medicine in it, right? So we're seeing Talmudic medicine here. Now note, in the earlier section, we had all of this kind of like framing around it, like, oh, there are those people who say this, and who says this, and what's this, and now we're just back to the sages said, right? So now we're back in the realm of like normative halacha, and now we're really seeing what is this word only about? Is this really limiting this in, as we've critiqued this, to say that it is kind of like almost protecting the injury, the person who caused the injury, and now we're seeing what does only mean. Only serves as a limiter to, yes, protect the person who caused the injury, but against the negligence of the injured party, right? Meaning, if I get injured and the doctor prescribes me medicine and I don't follow the doctor's instructions for the taking of that medicine and I get sick as a result of that, I can't blame the person who caused the injury. That wouldn't be fair. Do we all agree that that would not be fair? That's my own negligence. I should have followed doctor's orders, right? And so that's there to shield the person who caused the injury, not from responsibility for my healthcare costs. They still have to pay for the prescription that got me the crystalline ice plant, wax, and wine dregs, but I can't blame necrosis on them. It's my own fault, right? I should have followed the doctor's orders there. I saw something pop up in the chat, right? That's actually good medicine, right? Yeah. I don't either. I'm sure that there might be a way of kind of like honing in on like why was this the kind of the folk remedy there? We don't know. We also see that honey and candy they think is not good for your healing, right? Honey is a natural antibiotic. I think here they're talking about eating honey. Might also even be like mead, right? Like some sort of honey alcohol drink here. But what we've done now is we've solved this problem of like, I'm uncomfortable with how this seems to, not uphold the rights of the person who was injured. And what we understand now is their opinion is only about that and not about kind of broader degrees of responsibility. I'm going to do it next time on Talmud class, just so you see what's coming up. We're about to create all sorts of like really fun scenarios like, oh, but what if this happens? Oh, what if this happens? We're going to go right into malpractice questions. We're going to go into questions of like, can you pretend to be a doctor and heal someone if you're not actually a doctor? And so I think that we'll look at, we'll get to see like a lot of those specific questions that have already started coming up. Okay, Vanix, we've got 1 minute. Happy to go to you.
Just a comment that I think you are obliged to follow a doctor's orders. And it brings up the issues in this day and age of people who claim whiplash and so on, and are wearing collars and all kinds of things. And then they have detectives following them around to make sure that they're really injured. And they're their thing on and they're lifting furniture because they're a moving company. You got a problem there right away. So
but clearly a basic human problem that we have not seemed to have solved, right? Where it's, even a problem for the rabbis of 2,000 years ago. Okay, great, everybody. Happy Chag HaIlanot for Tu B'Shvat. Shabbat Shalom for tomorrow, and we'll see everybody.